My wife died, and 2 days later, her kids showed up with a trust ledger, like they were cleaning out a storage unit. Our home, our business, my life. Their lawyer told me to fight. I didn't. I signed everything. In a dying desert town where everybody watches and nobody helps. They laughed like I'd finally folded. Then my pen hit the last page, and Caleb Monroe stopped reading mid-sentence. His face went blank. If you want to see what that one line did to them, hit like, share, and subscribe. This town doesn't keep secrets. It keeps silence. It sits out here at the edge of the high desert, wrapped around a dead railway station that hasn't seen a train in years. The tracks are rusted. The ticket booth is boarded up. But the people still watch. From porches, from gas pumps, from behind windshields idling a little too long. Everybody knows who married who lost what, who's about to be taken apart. They just don't say it out loud. I was sitting alone in the house. Margaret and I built room by room. The floors still smelled like cleaner. Sharp, almost clinical. Like someone had already decided this place needed to be erased. Rachel arrived first. She didn't knock. She never did. Her heels didn't hesitate. That told me she'd rehearsed this walk. Dylan followed a minute later. Same stride, same confidence. Like they were entering an office they already owned. Neither of them called me stepdad. They used my name, clean, legal, final. Every sentence they spoke was technically correct. They'd learned that tone well. Calm, measured, framed like help. We just want to streamline things. This is standard. It's better if we handle it. They never raised their voices. They didn't have to. Rachel laid the folder on the table. Not gently, precisely. The trust ledger. Tabs marked, pages highlighted. It looked like something prepared long before Margaret died. Dylan leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching my face instead of the papers. He wasn't listening for answers. He was watching for resistance. I gave him none. For over 20 years, I carried what needed carrying. When the shop nearly folded, I stayed up nights recalculating orders. When tuition bills arrived, I paid them without discussion. When suppliers demanded cash up front, I sold my truck and walked. I rebuilt Margaret's business after the fire. I took calls she didn't want to take. I absorbed the risk so she could keep her hands clean. None of that was in the folder. Rachel cleared her throat and slid a single page forward. This is what you'll receive. Housing assistance, a monthly allowance, enough to live comfortably. Comfortably. The word landed like a coin dropped on concrete. In return, they needed access, accounts, signatures, authorization. Dylan smiled like this was mercy. I noticed how often they said things without actually asking. That's how it works when power is already assumed. You don't argue. You arrange. This wasn't shouting. It wasn't threats. It was paperwork. That's when I understood what this really was. Gaslighting doesn't always come with lies. Sometimes it comes wrapped in procedure, in language that turns decisions into obligations and erases consent under efficiency. They weren't telling me I was wrong. They were making it unnecessary for me to be right. Every document narrowed my options. Every explanation was delivered like a favor. And slowly, quietly, the ground shifted beneath my feet. Not because they pushed, because the system did. Rachel watched me the way people watch clocks when they already know the time. Dylan checked his phone. He wasn't worried. He was bored. They slid the final page closer. This just formalizes what's already decided, Rachel said. Already decided by whom wasn't something she felt the need to clarify. Outside, a pickup slowed as it passed the window. Someone glanced in, then drove on. The town was listening. And that's when they offered it. The last kindness, the allowance, the permission to exist without interfering. I looked at the numbers. I looked at the lines waiting for my signature. They mistook my silence for surrender. What they didn't realize was that silence, when backed by paperwork, is how power moves without being seen. And in this town, the quiet always comes right before something breaks. I didn't lose because I was weak. I lost because I taught them I would always step aside. It took me a while to see that. It usually does. For years, every conflict in this house ended the same way. I gave ground. Not because I agreed, but because it felt easier. Quieter. Like the kind of peace you buy by paying first and asking questions later. That pattern doesn't disappear. It teaches people. The first time Rachel said, "Let us handle it," it sounded considerate. She said it while setting a coffee down, eyes steady, voice calm. The second time, it came with paperwork already filled in. The third time, it came with a look that said I was slowing things down. Dylan perfected it. "Don't worry about the details. You've got enough on your plate. It's better if you don't get involved." None of it sounded hostile. That's what made it work. They weren't taking control by force. They were taking it by permission. Mine. I realized something standing there in the kitchen, listening to them explain my own life back to me. Every sentence removed a choice. Every reassurance narrowed the path. I wasn't being overruled. I was being managed. That's how kindness gets rebranded as access. When someone always yields, others start to lean. When someone never says no, people stop asking. I thought I was keeping the peace. What I was really doing was training an audience. The doubt crept in quietly, not from them, but from the gaps between their words. I started wondering things I'd never questioned before. Did Margaret plan this? Did she leave me exposed on purpose? Was I protecting a version of her that never existed? They let those questions hang. They didn't answer them. They didn't have to. Gaslighting doesn't require lies. It just requires enough structure to make resistance feel unreasonable. Forms, procedures, language that turns surrender into efficiency. The more they explained, the less space I had to think. That's when I noticed how rarely Margaret had explained anything near the end. She asked questions instead, about accounts, about inventory, about where we kept things. Then she'd go quiet when Dylan called, like she was counting beats in her head. At the time, I thought it was stress. Standing there with their folder open, I understood it was preparation. After they left, I walked out to the garage. It was late afternoon. The light came in low through the side window, catching dust in the air. The toolbox was still where I left it, under the workbench, paint chipped, latch stiff. I hadn't opened it since before the funeral. Inside, beneath wrenches and gloves, was something that didn't belong. A metal storage card. Old, scratched, wrapped in tape like someone didn't want it rattling loose. Margaret had always been careful with noise. I held it in my palm longer than I needed to. It wasn't labeled. It didn't explain itself. It just waited. That's when the shift happened. Not anger, not resolve, clarity. I saw the pattern all at once. My silence hadn't been read as dignity. It had been read as permission. My kindness hadn't been respected. It had been converted into leverage. And Margaret had seen it long before I did. She hadn't warned me because warnings create resistance. Resistance makes people cautious. Caution keeps mistakes small. What she left behind wasn't a message. It was a boundary disguised as absence. I put the card back where I found it and closed the toolbox. Not carefully, deliberately. If they thought I was finished because I stopped pushing back, They were about to learn the difference between giving up and stepping aside. In this house, kindness had been mistaken for weakness. I wasn't going to correct them with words. 6 months earlier, the signs were already there. I just didn't know what I was looking at. Margaret had started asking questions she never asked before. Not emotional ones, practical ones. Where the invoices were kept, which accounts were still under my name, how often I checked the statements. She didn't press. She listened, nodded, and wrote things down in a small notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer. At the time, I thought it was anxiety. Illness does that to people. It makes them want order. Some nights, she'd sit at the table long after dinner, sorting receipts while the house went quiet, the clock above the sink ticking louder than it should have. When Dylan called, she'd pause mid-page, not tense. Still, like she was measuring something invisible. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask. That was my pattern. Then there were the appointments. The bank first. Rachel insisted on coming just to help. She did most of the talking, used words like efficiency and consolidation. When I asked a question, she answered it sideways, already moving to the next form. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. Families do this. They step in when things get complicated. Later, it was the accountant. Dylan showed up unannounced, sat in the chair closest to the desk, spoke as if he'd already had authority. When I mentioned getting a second opinion, he laughed softly and said, "Why make it harder than it needs to be?" That sentence stayed with me, because it wasn't a no. It was a warning dressed as concern. The paperwork kept coming. Each document arrived with an explanation already attached. What it meant, why it mattered, why I didn't need to read too closely. Every time I slowed things down, someone reassured me. Every reassurance narrowed the space I was standing in. The most effective pressure never feels like pressure. It feels like help. I noticed I stopped seeing full statements, just summaries. I noticed passwords changing for security reasons. I noticed meetings happening without me that I only heard about afterward, framed as updates instead of decisions. When I brought it up once, Rachel smiled and said, "You're under enough stress. Let us carry this." Carry it where that question didn't come out of my mouth. It stayed in my head, where doubt belongs when you're trying not to cause trouble. That was the part I avoided thinking about. Why I avoided it. I didn't want to be the man who questioned his own family. I didn't want to turn grief into conflict. I didn't want to be seen as difficult. In this town, that label sticks. So I ignored the quiet alarms, the subtle shifts, the way conversations started ending before I'd said anything meaningful. Looking back, the pattern was obvious. Information flowed in one direction. Authority was assumed, never discussed. Choices were framed as conclusions. Gaslighting doesn't require cruelty. It requires structure. Enough layers between you and the truth that you start trusting the explanation more than your own instincts. Margaret saw it. I know that now. She started separating things. Slowly, not dramatically. I found folders in places they didn't belong. Notes tucked into books. Account numbers written in her careful handwriting, then crossed out and rewritten somewhere else. At the time, I thought she was disorganized. She wasn't. She was mapping exits. The night before she went into the hospital for the last time, she stood in the garage longer than usual. I was inside, rinsing dishes. I heard the metal clink of tools shifting, not searching, selecting. I didn't follow her out. That was my mistake. After the funeral, when everything accelerated, those earlier moments came back with weight, not as regret, as data. Each one a point on a line I'd refused to draw. That's when I made the decision. I wasn't going to confront anyone. I wasn't going to accuse or argue or demand explanations. Those reactions only tighten control. They force people to close ranks. Instead, I watched. I saved copies. I took notes. I tracked dates, language, who spoke for whom. I paid attention to what was said and, more importantly, what wasn't. Silence can be passive, or it can be strategic. I chose the second, because once you see the signs, you don't ring the bell right away. You listen to it. Dylan's invitation showed up the way pressure usually does in this town, polite on the surface, sharp underneath. "Dinner," he said on the phone. Just to do this the right way, people are talking. People were always talking. That was the point. I drove out at 7. The sky over the plateau was the color of old steel, and the wind pushed dust across the road. Dylan's new place sat on the edge of town, high enough to look down on everyone else. Fresh stucco, clean windows, a driveway wide enough for more than one victory. His porch light was too bright. It made the shadows behind the columns look deeper. Rachel opened the door first. She smiled like she'd practiced it. The smell inside was expensive seared meat, garlic, something sweet in a glass that didn't belong to a weekday. "Ethan," she said, like we were co-workers. "Come in." Dylan didn't stand up when I entered. He was already seated at the table, sleeves rolled, a watch catching the light every time he moved his wrist. He gestured to the chair across from him, the one that faced the kitchen and the hallway at the same time, a strategic seat. And then I saw the third plate. A man sat to Dylan's right, jacket still on, posture straight, eyes calm, not from here. He had the kind of calm you get from other people's money. A city calm. He didn't scan the room for exits. He scanned it for leverage, and he found it fast tonight. "Ethan," Dylan said. "This is Grant. He's advising us." Grant extended a hand. His grip was dry, controlled. "Sorry for your loss," he said, like he'd said it all week. I sat down without asking questions. Questions were what they wanted. Uncertain people get managed. Rachel poured wine. I didn't touch. Dylan cut into the steak like he'd earned it. Grant listened more than he spoke. They talked about Margaret like she was an asset. They used her name the way you use a label on a file folder. She would have wanted things handled cleanly, Rachel said. Dylan nodded. No drama. No delays. Grant glanced at me. Clean is good, he said. Courts like clean. I watched the tablecloth. White linen. Too perfect. A stage dressed for the kind of family photo you post after you've already won. Then Dylan leaned in. So, he said, Caleb tell you anything interesting today? I kept my face still. Caleb reads paper. I said, that's what he's paid for. Rachel's smile tightened. And you, how are you holding up? I didn't answer. I picked up my fork. Set it down. Let silence do what it does best, make people feel it. Dylan couldn't help himself. We're trying to make sure you're taken care of, he said. You don't need to worry about accounts, passwords, any of that. There it was again. Help, that sounded like a lock clicking. I gave them a small nod. Then I dropped something on purpose. Not a confession. A pebble. Margaret had this old metal card, I said. Like it was nothing. From that storage place by the rail yard. I found it in her things. Probably just junk. Rachel's hand paused over her glass. Grant's eyes flicked to Dylan. Quick! Dylan laughed too loudly. Storage place, he said. Why would she have that? I shrugged. She kept a lot of junk. Rachel reached for her glass, and her fingers slipped. The stem hit the table hard. Wine spilled across the linen, red spreading fast. Nobody moved to help her. Dylan's voice dropped. "Ethan," he said, "if you have anything, you need to tell us. We're family." Grant didn't blink. He watched me like I was a line item. I leaned back. "If I had something," I said, "I'd probably keep it where it belongs." "And where's that?" Dylan asked. I looked at the stain. "Not on this table." Dylan's jaw tightened. He wanted me to argue, to explain, to prove I wasn't crazy. That's how you lose. The person rushing to prove their truth is already handing over the steering wheel. So I ate 2 bites. I thanked them. I left. When I got home, the house felt colder. The air had that faint smell of dust that doesn't come from outside. I went straight to the garage. Nothing was missing, but the tool drawer wasn't the way I'd left it. A wrench turned the wrong direction. Tape set on top instead of tucked back. Order had been touched. And that was enough. I didn't go back to the house that night. I drove past the old rail station instead. It sat where the town used to breathe. Rusted tracks, boards over broken windows. A place nobody locked anymore because no one bothered to enter. Margaret used to call it quiet storage. I called it forgotten. The metal card fit the slot with a sound that carried in the empty building. The door slid open slow, like it was resisting being useful again. The unit smelled like paper and oil, cardboard boxes stacked clean. Not rushed, not panicked. Planned. I turned on my phone light and started opening them. The first box held folders, new folders, not the yellowed kind you accumulate by accident. These were labeled in Margaret's handwriting. Dates, account numbers, cross-references, trust ledger, revised. I sat on the concrete floor and kept reading. This wasn't a will. It was a system. Assets tied to obligations. Transfers that triggered audits. Signatures that pulled in third parties whether they liked it or not. Every line assumed someone greedy enough to rush. The next box held notebooks, ledger books, balanced by hand. Dates matched the folders. Payments routed through shells I didn't recognize at first, then did. I stopped breathing when I understood the pattern. She hadn't reacted late. She'd reacted early. I found the recorder last, wrapped in a cloth, labeled with nothing but a date. I pressed play. Margaret's voice filled the unit. Calm, precise, not sick, not scared. "If you're hearing this," she said, "it means they took the bait." I closed my eyes. She explained it simply. If I fought them at the beginning, they would retreat, delete files, close loops, make it a family dispute. So she needed them confident. She needed me to look broken. Every document assumed I would sign. Every trap depended on speed and arrogance. The more they grabbed, the more responsibility attached. The more they rushed, the less they checked. They weren't stealing an inheritance. They were volunteering for liability. I laughed once, not because it was funny, because it was exact. Margaret didn't protect me by standing in front of them. She stepped aside and let them run forward. That's when I understood the signing. It wasn't surrender, it was timing. If I hesitated, they'd slow down. If I argued, they'd lawyer up. If I showed doubt, they'd stop talking. Silence kept them moving. Every meeting, every dinner, every helpful offer. Another signature, another transfer, another piece of evidence they thought was clean. They thought winning meant possession. Margaret knew winning meant exposure. I packed the boxes back the way I found them, locked the unit. The metal door rolled shut without complaint. Outside, the station light flickered once, then steadied. I sat in the truck and called Caleb. "I'm not trying to get anything back," I said when he answered. He didn't interrupt. "I need a room?" I said. A table, cameras, witnesses. There was a pause. Papers moving. "You're ready," he said. "No," I told him. "They are." I drove home slower than usual. The town lights blinked on one by one. Same streets, same houses, same silence. By the time I parked, I knew exactly how this would end. Not with shouting, with signatures. Caleb didn't sit across from me. He stood by the window. Late afternoon. His office lights still off. The courthouse across the street emptying out. One clerk at a time. "If you do this privately," he said, "they'll shrink the story." He didn't look at me when he spoke. He watched the street. "They'll say you misunderstood. That grief made you paranoid. That paperwork is confusing. That you signed because you wanted to." I stayed quiet. "That's how it works," he went on. "One-on-one. They control the frame. They turn facts into feelings. They make you defend your sanity instead of your case." He finally turned around. "And the moment you start explaining yourself, you're already losing." He pulled a folder from his briefcase. Not thick. Clean. "This," he said, tapping it once, "isn't emotional evidence. It's structural. Timelines, transfers, dependencies." He paused. "Your wife didn't leave you words. She left you witnesses." That landed. I'd been thinking about proof like a shield. Something to block attacks. Margaret thought of it like a spotlight. Caleb flipped the folder open. Inside were copies of what I'd seen at the station. Ledger pages, transaction maps, names that didn't belong in family conversations. "Each of these," he said, "means nothing alone. Together, they require a room." He closed the folder. "Not your house, not a diner, not anywhere they can lean back and act familiar." I pictured Dylan's kitchen, the wine, the casual confidence, the way people speak when they think no one is counting. "We need a place," Caleb said, "where silence feels wrong." He said it plainly, like logistics. A notary office works. Cameras, staff, neutral ground. A table where every sentence becomes a record. I nodded. "They'll come relaxed," he added, "because they think this is the end. Just signatures." That word sat heavy. Signatures. Margaret had known they'd rush toward that word like it meant victory. Caleb leaned against the desk now, arms crossed. "When people believe they're winning," he said, "they stop managing themselves." I asked him what my role was. "Minimal," he said. "You agree. You don't challenge. You let them explain things they shouldn't." He smiled once. "Brief. They'll talk. They always do." I thought about all the times I'd tried to clear the air, to explain intentions, to smooth over tension. Caleb shook his head before I could say it. "This isn't about fairness," he said. "It's about position." He slid a calendar toward me. One date circled. "Morning. They need to believe you're still who they think you are," he said. "Tired. Relieved. Done." I signed my name on the corner of the calendar. Just ink. No meaning. As I stood to leave, Caleb added one more thing. "Justice works best," he said, "when it has an audience that can't look away." Outside, the streetlight flickered on. One bulb, then another. I walked to my truck and sat there for a minute, hands on the wheel, engine off. I wasn't afraid of the meeting. I was afraid of how confident they'd be. And that was exactly the point. They would walk into that room believing they were collecting. They wouldn't realize they were being introduced to the version of the story that didn't need my voice at all. The room was already lit when I arrived. Not soft light, not evening light. White overhead panels that left nowhere to stand without being seen. A rectangular table. 3 chairs on one side, 2 on the other. A camera mounted high in the corner, its red dot steady. Dylan walked in first. New suit, easy smile, the kind he practiced in mirrors. Rachel followed, heels sharp against the tile, phone face down in her hand, like this was just another errand. The third man came last, the financial partner. He shook Caleb's hand like they'd never met, which told me everything. They sat together, comfortable, leaning back. This was what winning looked like to them. Caleb waited until everyone was settled, until the notary adjusted her papers, until the door clicked shut. Then he opened the trust ledger, not the old one. The revised copy landed on the table with a sound that made Dylan lean forward. Caleb didn't explain. He read, clause by clause. Asset transfers linked to debt responsibility. Control tied to reporting obligations. Beneficiaries assuming liability the moment they took possession. Rachel's smile faded first. She reached for the document, then stopped when Caleb didn't slide it toward her. This version, he said, supersedes the previous draft upon signature. Dylan laughed once. Short? That's fine, he said. We're ready to sign. Caleb nodded and kept reading. Numbers followed. Account routes. Dates that started months before Margaret died. The partner shifted in his chair. Then Caleb pressed play. Margaret's voice filled the room. Calm. Precise. Recorded before anyone thought they were being watched. She spoke about contingency, about timing, about how quickly greed moves when it thinks no one is counting. No names, no accusations. Just structure. The room went quiet in a way that felt different, heavy, permanent. Rachel broke it. This is out of context, she said. You can't. Caleb raised one finger. She stopped. He slid the accounting journal forward, open to a marked page. This entry, he said, routes funds through an entity you're not listed on. He turned the page. This one, he said, assumes ownership you didn't have yet. The partner leaned back now, farther than before. Dylan looked at me for the first time that day. Really looked. You knew, he said. I didn't answer. Caleb closed the folder. You have a choice, he said, evenly. Accept the inheritance in full, assets and obligations. He paused. Or walk away now. No signatures, no claims. Rachel's hand shook when she reached for her pen. The partner stood up. I need to speak to my attorney, he said. Caleb nodded. You're free to go. He didn't look back when he left. Dylan stared at the document. The confidence drained slow, like air from a tire. This isn't how it was supposed to go, he said. Caleb slid the pen across the table. It's exactly how it goes, he replied. When everything is visible. They signed. Both of them. One after the other. Hands unsteady. Movements small. The notary stamped the page. Once. Twice. The sound echoed. No one spoke. When it was done, Dylan pushed his chair back too hard. Rachel didn't look at me at all. They left without shaking hands. The red dot on the camera stayed on. I sat there for a moment after everyone else stood, breathing, listening to the hum of the lights. Power doesn't disappear when it's challenged. It disappears when it's documented. When I walked outside, the sun was still up. Same street, same town. But the shadows were shorter, and for the first time, there was nowhere left for them to hide. Noah arrived 2 days later, not during the meetings, not when papers were moving. He came after everything went quiet. It was morning. The station lot was empty. Wind pushed dust along the tracks. I was sitting on the hood of my truck, coffee gone cold. Noah didn't ask questions. He leaned against the door and waited. That's how he always was, present without pressure. He didn't bring money, didn't bring advice. He brought time. I told him it was over. That they signed. Noah nodded once, like he already knew. You okay? I said yes. It came out automatically. Noah didn't react. He looked past me toward the tracks. Then he said something simple, something that stayed. You didn't lose yourself. We stood there. A train horn sounded far away. I realized something I hadn't allowed before. I didn't survive because I outplayed anyone. I survived because someone stayed. Noah had known Margaret. Not well, but enough. He helped rebuild the shop after the fire. Never asked for credit. He showed up when it mattered. I asked him why he came now. Noah shrugged, said it felt like the right time. Then he looked at me. Some people only show up when you're weak, he said. They call it family. He paused. But family doesn't arrive to take. Another pause. Family arrives to stand. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't explain. He said it like weather, like gravity. I thought about Dylan, about Rachel, how they only came when Margaret was gone, how every visit had an ask attached to it, how love had slowly turned into leverage. I didn't feel anger or relief. It felt like something closing, not a wound, a chapter. For years, I'd confused endurance with belonging. I thought staying meant being chosen. Noah never tested that idea. He never needed proof. He was there before the mess. He was there after the noise. That's when it landed. What kept me standing wasn't the assets. It wasn't the documents or the clauses. It was one person treating my presence as enough. Noah checked his watch. Same old habit. You need anything? I shook my head. Stay for a bit, I said. He nodded. We sat on the hood, watched dust move across steel. No planning, no next steps, just quiet that didn't feel empty. I understood then. Winning isn't loud. It doesn't clap or smile. It doesn't need witnesses. It just leaves you intact. Noah didn't save me. He reminded me I wasn't abandoned. That was enough. Not triumph, not closure. Just the end of an illusion, and the beginning of something honest. I went back to the station alone, late afternoon. The sun sat low, stretching shadows across the platform. The building hadn't changed. Same cracked paint, same broken clock frozen at a time no one bothered to fix. This was where Margaret and I used to sit, on that bench near the far track. When the town still had people coming and going, I brushed dust off the wood before sitting down. The bench creaked the same way it always had. For a moment, I didn't think about anything. I just listened. Wind through weeds, metal cooling in the shade. That's when I noticed it. A small wooden plaque tucked beneath the bench slat, newer than the rest. Easy to miss unless you knew to look. Margaret had left it. No dates, no names. Just one sentence. Not poetic, not sentimental. It said, "Keep what's clean. Let the rest go." I sat there longer than I planned. I thought about how much she understood. Not just the law. People. She didn't leave me comfort. She left me direction. The tracks in front of me were rusted. No trains ran here anymore. But between the rails, weeds had pushed through, green against steel. They didn't need permission. They didn't ask if it was their place. They grew anyway. I realized something watching them. Not everything needs to last to matter. The station didn't. The business didn't. But what we built between us did. Margaret never told me to fight out of anger. She never told me to win at any cost. She designed something quieter. Order instead of revenge. Structure instead of noise. I understood why now. If I had gone after them with bitterness, I would have stayed tied to them. Every move would still be about them. Instead, the ending cut clean. They signed. They left. No drama. No speeches. Just consequences. I looked at the plaque again. Keep what's clean. That meant the boundaries. The truth. The parts of my life that didn't require explanation. Let the rest go. That meant the guilt. The need to be understood by people who never listened. I stood up. The bench stayed where it was. The weeds kept growing. I didn't need to preserve everything. Some things are meant to end properly. I sold the parts of the past that kept me anchored. Kept the parts that still worked. The house stayed. The routine stayed. The silence changed. Wasn't heavy anymore. It was usable. I didn't win by humiliating anyone. I won by restoring order. That's the part people miss. Winning with anger feels powerful. Winning with structure lasts longer. Margaret knew that. She didn't ask me to destroy anyone. She asked me to stand correctly. I walked back to my truck. The sun dipped behind the station roof. The tracks disappeared into shadow. The weeds didn't. They caught the last of the light, and for the first time since everything began, I felt finished. Not empty. Finished. The right kind. Before we end this, there's something I need to say. If any part of this story felt familiar, don't brush that feeling aside. Most people do. They don't ask. Is this manipulation? They ask, am I being selfish? That question keeps people stuck. So let me be clear. There are a few early signs that matter. They're quiet. They don't look like abuse. First, information gets blurry. Numbers change. Details are explained for you, instead of to you. You're told it's complicated, or that you wouldn't understand. Second, your voice gets isolated. You're discouraged from asking anyone else. A lawyer, a friend, an advisor. Not directly. Just enough to make it feel unnecessary. Or disloyal. Third, you start doubting yourself. Not because you're wrong, but because every concern is reframed as drama. You're told you're imagining things, that you're emotional, that you're making problems where none exist. If those three things show up together, pause. That's not love protecting you. That's control staying hidden. If you're in that place right now, you don't need to confront anyone tonight. You don't need to win an argument. You need something simpler. Write things down. Dates, conversations, what was said, what changed. Keep copies of documents. Even if you don't know why yet, talk to someone independent, not someone who benefits from keeping things quiet. And set one boundary, just one. It can be small. I'll review this first. I'll think about it. I'll get advice. Watch what happens when you do. The reaction will tell you more than the answer ever could. If you've been through something like this, you're not alone. A lot of people carry these stories quietly because the manipulation didn't look dramatic enough to justify speaking up. If you're comfortable, share your experience in the comments, not to relive it, not to accuse anyone, just to let someone else reading know they're not imagining things either. And if this story helped you name something you couldn't before, consider staying with the channel. These stories aren't about revenge. They're about clarity. Justice doesn't need shouting. It needs the right place, the right moment, and the right witnesses. If you recognize the signs, don't ask whether you're selfish. Ask whether you're being kept in the dark. That question changes everything.